So the next keynote will be given by Professor Joe Devlin. So Professor Joe Devlin is a professor at, at the University College London, and so he will give a presentation of the potential ethical problem of using consumer neuroscience.
Thank you very much, Kazue. Well, thanks. You've hardly heard from me today, so this will be a change. One of the things that I've been really excited about in the last 2 days is all of the applications. And I think this morning we've heard such incredible examples of how behavioral science, psychology, neuroscience are being used in pro-social ways to benefit society, benefit individuals, benefit educational purposes. And that's obviously why we're all here and why we're excited about this kind of field, which I'm broadly just going to refer to as consumer neuroscience. But there's a downside to it too, and that is that there's potential for abuse and misuse, and it's come up a little bit in questions occasionally today and yesterday. But I think that it's important that we as a community address those issues and validate the fact that there are some genuine concerns here. I'm going to illustrate every one of my points with real-world examples. So I haven't made anything up. As far as I know, I haven't exaggerated anything, which means that some of them are a little disturbing, and I apologize for that in advance. I will try not to be negative, though. My aim is to try to extract a set of principles that we can use as a sort of basis for a voluntary code of ethics, so that we make sure that what we're doing, whether we're in academia, whether we're in industry, government, whatever the case may be, is really at the highest ethical standards, so that we can preclude those worries about abuse and misuse. Headlines like this are increasingly common, right? The state is abolishing privacy in its reckless embrace of new technology. And so this is an article about how personal assistants, Siri and Alexa, and those kind of things are essentially listening to you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in the privacy of your own home. So it's not just when you say, Alexa, what's the weather today? It's always, listening. And what's more, there's evidence that those data are being recorded and stored centrally by some of these service providers, right? And we know that that's true of when we interact on the computer as well. You know that you maintain a digital footprint that can be tracked by corporations, that can be tracked by government agencies. We often don't think about it a lot, but it's a fact of life at this point. So even in our own homes, there is a serious encroachment of technology on our personal privacy. Now, it doesn't get any better when we go outside, right? So in 2011, there was a survey in the United Kingdom that suggested that just under 2 million surveillance cameras were deployed in the country, and that the average person showed up on 70 cameras a day. I'm not sure, but my informal polling here in Yokohama might make those numbers seem small. I seem to have shown up on more cameras than I've ever seen before, including every taxi I've ever been in. So there's this increased surveillance, and at some level, that doesn't worry me, but when you couple it with the fact that facial recognition software, facial analysis software, facial coding is very widely available, that means that now, when you're outside your home, we can be tracking where you are, what time of day you're there, who you're with, and possibly even to some extent your emotional state during those interactions. So this kind of automated technology means that there's much more feasible to do mass surveillance of the population than it ever was before. This is another actual headline from CNN in the week right before I came to this meeting, where they say brain implants could give governments and companies the power to read your mind. Now, those kind of headlines that are intended to be scary normally exaggerate what was actually said, but this was a report commissioned by the Royal Society in the UK, which is the highest level of academic standard. And this is literally what it said in this report. The concern was that brain-machine interfaces, and particularly implants, might not just do what they're intended. So if you're a cochlear implant patient, you know, someone who has trouble hearing and needs a cochlear implant, or you're a Parkinson's patient about to have deep brain surgery, and you read this, that's got to be terrifying. This idea that they're going to put this medical device in your brain, in theory to help you, but maybe to actually monitor your thoughts and even manipulate them if without your knowledge. So this is the framework that I think that we live in at the moment. And I think that there are a couple things that come up. Often, people describe these kind of technological advances as Orwellian, right? So they're talking about George Orwell's 1984 and his newspeak and his mind police. And I get that. I actually think that Aldous Huxley's Brave New World is a better example, because in Huxley's book, the advances in psychology were used to sort of dominate the masses and manipulate their thinking, limit their choices, and force them into mass consumption, right? So make them little buying machines, all for their own good, of course. But that's the kind of framework that I think we're in. And as I said, I'd like to see to what extent that's valid, and if so, what are the things that we might do about it? So I'm going to try to do this from multiple perspectives, and I'm going to start with consumers, because that's all of us. We're all in our lives consumers, as well as whatever else we do. And this is the area that, you know, where this comes up most frequently. So the two main concerns within the general public have to do with privacy, a right to privacy, and a right to have a freedom from manipulation. Or, in Takia's terms, the issues are read out and write in, right? These are exactly the concerns that people have. So let's start with privacy, because I think that one's in some ways more obvious. And I actually think it's a greater concern. So in consumer neuroscience, when we run experiments to do these, you know, kind of work, we ask volunteers. We ask people to participate. They volunteer to come to our experiments. We use the various different types of tools. So we've seen examples of MRI, EEG, biometrics, eye tracking, as well as other types of methods. But the important thing that's going on here is all of the people who are in these studies are volunteers, right? And that, I think, forms the first principle. Whatever we do should be voluntary. It should not be coercive, and it's something that people should opt into rather than have to opt out of. Okay? But with that in mind, a lot of our participants still have serious issues and concerns about their privacy. Why? Because we tell them what we're doing, right? I'm going to play an ad. I'm going to measure your brain activity. I'm going to see, you know, emotional responses in your brain to this ad. And they think that's true. They believe that. But they worry that we do more than that, that also we're maybe reading their thoughts, and that we're getting information about their health or their private lives that we couldn't have otherwise, because they're in this fancy brain tech, right? So I think that raises a second principle, which is that our data collection needs to be limited in the sense that it needs to be explicitly related to whatever our goals are. And we have to be clear that we're not collecting data beyond that. And I think that that's the first two principles. Because without that, essentially we don't have a lot of trust from the general population or even the specific participants in our experiments. And it turns out trust is a big issue. So every year, Ipsos Mori, which is a big consumer research company, does this poll about how much we trust different professions. And they literally ask people, they say, now I'm going to read a list of different people. For each, can you tell me if you generally trust them or not? And I'll just sort of highlight, because lucky for me, scientists and professors come out as about 85% trusted, which is great. But I'd like to point out that advertising executives are the bottom, below politicians, right? Think about how bad that trust situation is if you are worse than politicians, right? So I think that this is a point that's really important for us to remember. If this is the general public's perception of our field, and it's not specific to consumer neuroscience, but that's the baseline, then I think there's something that we need to address here. And let me just give an example. This is a billboard, a digital billboard in one of the airports in London that's run by Deloitte Digital. And I don't know about you, but I didn't spot that camera when I went by this billboard, right? So I highlighted it in this slide. But that is a face recognition camera so that they can track people in the airport as they walk by, as they look at the billboard, and they can track their eyes, right? So nobody in this situation is necessarily opted in. These are just people in the airport, right? And nonetheless, there's a good deal of personal data being collected in this scenario. So they collect how many people go by, how long you stop and look, and what you're looking at the time. And of course, those data are very commercially relevant, right? They can measure which ads are playing, which ones create the greatest engagement, which ones attract attention better than others, and whether that varies across the day. And in fact, this is a data set from Deloitte, from this particular billboard, where they're tracking specifically those things as well as your average amount of time that you spend looking at this billboard. Now, nobody opted into this. Nobody knows exactly what data they've collected. So you don't need personal information for this, but they've got it. They've got your face, and with simple commercially available software, they can have your gender, your approximate age, your race. There's all sorts of pieces of information. You don't know. You didn't opt in. So I think that this raises a third principle, which is one of transparency. I think that no matter what, we need to be doing this with an informed consent. We can't be doing things on the sly. And of course, there are ways to provide informed consent that are definitely not happening here. There's no effort to tell you that there's a camera. The camera is largely hidden so that you don't notice it. This cute little paper from the MIT Media Lab is a wolf in sheep's clothing. So I read this title, Eulerian Video Magnification for Revealing Subtle Changes in the World, and nearly fell asleep, right? Because I have no idea what that means. Let me tell you what it means when I started looking at it a little bit more carefully. This group has figured out a way to take heart rate measurements using a standard camera, like the one on the Deloitte billboard. And what they're doing is incredibly clever. And it's the same basic idea that underlies FNIRS that Kazue and both Matt were talking about yesterday, which is that when your heart constricts and it forces blood into your skin, that blood has it absorbs green light a little bit more than when the heart expands and the blood goes into your veins more. You can't see that. It's a very, very subtle change, and of course we take it for granted. But if you put somebody in front of a camera, exactly like the camera on my laptop, for instance, which is what they use in this experiment, was a laptop camera, they can measure heartbeat. So they're magnifying the color changes, and then they're trying to get the rhythm, and all of a sudden they're getting a biometric measurement of me without my knowledge. Again, this is seriously creepy. This has been patented in the US. This is commercially available under this patent, okay? Let me just take it a further step. So those are two ways of doing remote sensing that already get away from informed consent, that gets away from transparency, limitedness of data collection, and the fact that it's voluntary. This is a state-of-the-art magnetoencephalography machine about 5 years ago. It weighs about 8 tons. It looks like a giant hairdryer. There is no ambiguity when you're in an MEG machine, right? This is the version of it from last year where they've developed a personalized one that you can move around in. Now, from a scientific perspective, that's amazing because there's so much you can't do sitting in that chair that you can do if you can move around freely. The current version of this technology works in a bicycle helmet. So it doesn't even require being personalized. So I'm not aware that we can, at this point, read brainwaves or read hemodynamic activity remotely. But I honestly can't think that we're that far away from being able to do it. And this, even without any further technological advances, I think raises the serious question about whether we should have a right to cognitive privacy, right? Does your thinking, your brain activity, your physiological activity, do you own that? Or does everyone else have a right to that material, whether or not you want them to? Okay. And I think that's a tricky question, but let me just illustrate this with some real examples, right? So in Britain, the Royal Bank of Scotland is a big employer of graduates, and they have started using brain scanning technology to help fill their graduate positions. So this isn't wildly different from the idea that Matt was talking about, although the technology is EEG instead of FNIRS, and the way they're using that technology at Royal Bank of Scotland is entirely unclear, whereas Matt has published his in peer-reviewed journals, and it's at least accessible to everyone. What they're doing is you're a young graduate, you're looking to get a job, and you are required, when you do your job interview, to sit in front of a computer, watch some still images, and watch video while they put an EEG set on your head and read your brain activity. Again, for your own good, because they're going to take your brain activity and then suggest areas that you would be most effective in. The people who've been in this don't have the right to not do EEG, but they do allegedly have the right to have their data removed, right? So Royal Bank of Scotland will say that they will remove or delete the data afterwards if you ask them to. But this is just coercive, right? I mean, there are all sorts of things that can go wrong with this. So as a neuroscientist, I think, first of all, I don't believe that what they're doing makes any sense, and I have no confidence in their methods in this particular case. And that makes me feel slightly better. But if you just think about, one, I think we're coercing a voluntary group. Two, this has enormous potential for discrimination, whether it's intentional or not intentional. Now, I cannot hire you based on what your brain told me, right? Can I explain why? No. So do I have to? I mean, there are laws that say I can't discriminate on gender, I can't discriminate on race, on religion, on sexual preference. Those things are protected. But that doesn't matter. Now I can just discriminate on this completely opaque brain signal, whether I mean to or not. And for instance, let me give you an example. If the normative data that has been collected fits what we talked about as weird before, which tends to be a very limited sample, then anybody who doesn't fit that general demographic profile may have signals that are outside the norm. So we're essentially discriminating against groups that weren't used to create the basic technology. And the people at Royal Bank of Scotland may or may not know that. So I'm not saying that they're purposely using this discriminatively. I'm just saying that the possibility exists, and it's not even a stretch. If that was bad, in China, China's mining the data directly from workers' brains on an industrial scale. So that is to say, the Chinese government now requires certain professions to wear EEG headsets during their daily day at work, right? And these include certain members of the military, factory workers, and high-speed train drivers. Now, what they're told is that this is so that they can improve efficiency. But nobody has any idea what that means. And there was a quote from one of the scientists involved who said, "They thought we could read their minds. This caused some discomfort and resistance in the beginning. After a while, they got used to the device." So they didn't even try to deny that they think they can read their minds, right? What they said was, if you just tolerate it long enough, everybody will get used to it. This is Orwellian. This is Brave New World, right? This is coercive. They don't know what data is being collected. They don't know what the data are being used for. So there's no transparency, and they have no opportunity to opt out of it. You opt out, and you lose your job. And this is currently in place in China. I'll take it another level. In India, there was a woman in 2008, I think, named Aditi, who was convicted of murder in large part based on her brain scan. Okay? So this is the judge in the case, Shalini Pransalkar Joshi, who included a 9-page component in her decision letter on how the brain data, the fact that she submitted to an EEG, showed that there was neural evidence of knowledge of the crime, knowledge of the weapon, which in this case was arsenic, and knowledge of the murder situation. Now, the judge also said in an interview to the press afterwards, she finds it hard to believe because this was a 24-year-old, middle-class, calm, unassuming woman who murdered her ex-fiancé in cold blood at a restaurant. But she is now serving a life sentence in jail because of her EEG data. Not her testimony, not witness evidence, brain data. okay? 2 other people in the following 6 months were convicted of murder based on their own brain data. And now the company that does this says they do 15 cases a month in courts in India. This technology has been licensed to Singapore, to Florida, and to Australia, okay? It has not yet appeared in a court case in any of those 3 countries. Florida's not a country. But in any of those 3 places. But nonetheless, there are, police forces who have this, and I think this is seriously, seriously wrong. So the US Constitution has a clause in it that says that no person shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against themselves. This is what's called the fifth article of the Bill of Rights. And what's interesting about this, because there isn't a great deal of law that's relevant, is the way this has been interpreted in the courts. So at one level, you might think, well, that would stop this from happening in Florida, at least. Except for it's been very, very carefully construed to mean testimony, spoken or written testimony. They can force you to provide a blood sample, DNA sample, semen sample, and that can be used against you. So where do brain waves, brain activity fit? Is that a physical measurement? Sure it is, right? Is that something that would be used against you? Well, in India, it's being used against people. There are at least 3 people serving life sentences for murder. So it's really a tricky situation, right? To my mind, there's a really compelling need for a right to cognitive privacy. How we work out exactly what's in that right is tricky, and I would love to discuss it, but I think that at a minimum it should involve the principles of transparency, limited, and voluntary. And we'll talk about 2 others as we go. But for a moment, I'd like to turn to the idea that you have this, the worry is that neuroscience can be manipulating people, not just sort of reading out, but writing in. Now, Hilke Plasman yesterday set the stage for this one, so I'll just go over it briefly. But in 2004, when Sam McClure and Reed Montague did their famous Pepsi Challenge experiment, where they looked to see what was happening in the brains of these people as they were drinking Coke or Pepsi, their 2 main findings were, one, that this ventral medial prefrontal region that Hilke and others have talked about already rather extensively showed activity that was proportional to the value that the participants were seeing. But when you look specifically at branding, you got this dorsolateral prefrontal activity shown there on the right, as well as some other regions. Now, the authors, I don't think, expected the response. So this was a paper published in Neuron. It was peer-reviewed. They had a great sample of participants. So it was a really good study. But the press got hold of this, and there were marches in Texas against these neuroscientists. This gentleman, Gary Ruskin, who's one of the 2 heads of this consumer watchdog organization, Commercial Alert, wrote to the US Congress to stop neuroscientists from doing this. And what he wrote was, what would happen if corporate marketers and political consultants could literally peer inside our brains and chart the neural activity that leads to our selections in the supermarket and voting booth? What if they could trigger this neural activity by various means so as to modify our behavior and serve their own ends? Now look, there's nothing in the Coke-Pepsi experiment that suggests that you could modify behavior, but as soon as people were aware that you could read out in this level of detail, they were immediately concerned that maybe you could start to manipulate it as well. Now, it's interesting because the Senate chose not to pass any laws limiting sort of neuromarketing or consumer neuroscience, but this group then sued Reed Montague and another colleague to try to stop him from doing this work. And at some level, it's worked. So Reed's now he's been at UCL for a while, and I've talked to him about why he no longer does this area. And it's a combination of the fact that he thinks that it's not well enough developed, but it wasn't worth the hassle. He didn't want to deal with, attacks on him or his family because people were concerned that he was somehow this mad scientist who was going to be manipulating the general public. Which, look, if you're an animal neuroscientist, you're used to the idea that you have to be concerned about the general public because if they get angry enough, they come at you and your family. And I have friends who have been in bombs because their family does neuroscience, right? This is essentially Reed's point. He's a brave individual and he's a smart guy, but he was also actually worried for the safety of his family. So I have a great short video that I hope plays.
What consumer neuroscience doesn't do is tap into a buy button in the brains of consumers. And what consumer neuroscience doesn't do is create advertising that makes consumers into robots and automatons who blindly move away from free will and buy whatever advertisers want. Because if we did find a buy button, I probably wouldn't be standing here talking to you.
Right. Okay. So this is Carl Markey, or Marcy, I'm not sure exactly how he pronounces it, the head of Nielsen Neuroscience, the single largest neuromarketing company worldwide, who is speaking at a neuro-ethics meeting about the ethics of neuromarketing, and his response is, yeah, we can't do that, but damn it, I wish we could, because then I'd be out of here and you guys would be in trouble. This is, why do you wonder why we're not trusted, right? I mean, that's Orwellian. This is Brave New World, Machiavellian. It's not funny, okay? It's creepy doing that. And it doesn't help to be one of the most prominent, advocates for this technology in the world, and try, essentially scaring the public. So let's just think about the way we actually do use consumer neuroscience, right? So there's lots of different persuasion models in the world, and this is just one of them that I think captures some of the essentials. We could definitely argue whether or not it's the best model, but the point is that there are 3 phases to a normal persuasion attempt, right? The first phase is you create whatever your campaign is, your creative, etc., and then normally you do some kind of testing, whether it's focus groups or otherwise. And this is where consumer neuroscience mostly fits in. That is to say, we have additional tools that we can bring to bear to test both explicit responses, like focus groups, but also more implicit responses, like some of the things that we've heard over the last 2 days. And this is a really valuable tool because what we do is we get some feedback and then refine our persuasion campaign. We then enter the second phase where we put that persuasion campaign out in the world in hopes of affecting people's cognitive states, emotional states, right? So we want to affect their mind. That's what the campaign is for, in hopes that that affects their behavior, which is the third stage. But what we don't see here is anything about how consumer neuroscience moves to that third phase. We're not manipulating internal states in individuals, and I'm going to exclude explicitly some of the TMS and neurostimulation devices, which can be used to manipulate neural state directly. And of course, that's not scalable. You can't do this in grocery stores or on shop floors or whatever. This requires a lab and a person, and it's a different situation. At the moment, it's only feasibly used in sort of controlled lab environments. And we've heard lots of good examples of using TDCS, TACS, TMS, neurostimulation. That's not what we're talking about here, right? This is the standard model, and as it stands, there's nothing about what we're doing which isn't the same as any advertising or marketing campaign in terms of its manipulation. If it's a really good campaign, maybe you take more attention, pay more attention, but we're not changing anybody's state directly using these techniques. And I think that raises a fourth principle, which is one of autonomy. We're doing nothing to manipulate the internal state, so we're not asking people to do anything they wouldn't do otherwise. How do you know, right? I mean, at the moment, the only way that this is monitored is with sort of watchdog organizations. Typically, we're talking about governments, right? So whether they pass laws to prohibit certain activities or not, in this case, that's not true. I'm aware of very few legal positions that have been made specifically to deal with neuromarketing or consumer neuroscience. The only one that I've run across is that apparently in the UAE, in the Arab Emirate, I'm going to get it wrong. In the UAE, if you want to be a neuromarketing company, you have to get a license from the government in order to operate. And that's the single case that I've come across at this point. That's just not true here. It's not true in the States. It's not true anywhere in Europe. Because, you know, the advances are happening faster than the law, which is always the case with tech changes. That doesn't mean that there aren't groups that are interested, though. So, for instance, there are these quasi-governmental groups like the Advertisement Standards Agency in the US, or the Federal Trade Commission in the UK, I think I just reversed them, and the Fair Trade Commission here in Japan, which do look for flagrant violations and try to attend to them. So in the States, for instance, there's a company called Loomis Labs that makes a brain training program called Lumosity. And one of the things that they were advertising was that their brain training program keeps you, from basically brain aging. You will prevent the onset of dementia. And what happened was various, people in the public got in touch with the Federal Trade Commission and said, is this true? This is clearly what they're stating in their advertising. Is there truth to this? And the Federal Trade Commission asked them for their evidence, and they didn't have it. And they eventually took them to court, and Lumosity was fined $2 million for false advertising, right? So they had no evidence to support their claims, which would happen with any kind of advertising. This is, what the Federal Trade Commission is exactly supposed to do. But fundamentally, this is a reactive process, right? It's always going to trail the field. As we develop new things, governments and these organizations are going to have to try to keep up. And this is not good for trust, right? So every successful case along this line further convinces the public that what we're doing is evil, manipulative, invasive of privacy, right? Because they know a court just fined them $2 million. They wouldn't have done that if they were good, upstanding people just doing the right thing. Which raises the perspective of, well, how do we do this? And I think that the right way to handle this is for the business and the scientific community who are involved to be very proactive. That is to say, we can develop a set of principles, a code of conduct, that we choose to sign up to and that guides what we're doing. So that is to say, we try to limit ourselves, police ourselves. Now, for businesses, you might sort of ask, well, why would you do that, right? I mean, what's the motivation? And I think this speaks to the point that Nicola raised earlier around integrity, right? So businesses have values that they stand by, whatever they are, and they vary across each company. If those values then determine the principles and then the practices within the company. So if integrity is an important principle that you want, then it's something that we should sign up to and be proactive about rather than sort of wait and just do whatever and get it wrong, because that sends the wrong message. And let me just give one or two examples. Has anybody seen this Porsche ad where they compare the excitement in driving a Porsche to flying a fighter jet? Not a soul. Okay. Well, that will both bum out and please Porsche. For what it's worth, it's quite an entertaining video, and I recommend it. It's like 7 minutes long. But so they have this guy, Jörg, who is he's going to sit in a fighter jet while wearing an EEG set under his flight helmet that, honest to God, reads Maverick, like from Top Gun. He's having his EEG recorded while this pilot takes him up in a MiG and flies him around and does these incredible aeronautic things that make him go and crazy things like that. And of course, they then cut to Dr. Scientist in the little bunker, who's showing the real-time brain activity from this guy's head about dopamine release. And then they bring him down, they put him in a Porsche on a closed track, and the driver does the same thing, and then we get back to the bunker, and there's Dr. Scientist showing this dopamine release and how very similar it is between the fighter jet and the Porsche. And the end is, driving a Porsche is nearly as exciting as flying a fighter jet. Now, not to put too fine a point on it, but this is utter crap, right? So anybody with a neuroscience background will immediately know that these data aren't just wrong, like Lumosity's. They've actually been faked. This is false. EEG doesn't measure dopamine release. There is no real-time link. The things that they show are false. Turns out the guy who was their scientist isn't even a scientist. I mean, it was a very flagrantly fraudulent advertising. And it didn't get a whole lot of attention, as evidenced by the amount of people in the room who had seen it. So it wasn't penalized. But look, if you're Porsche, is that the message you want to send? You're a company that prides themselves on their engineering, on their high-tech science, to produce high-quality cars that perform at the highest levels. What you're saying in this ad is, oh no, we fake our science. It's totally crap, and it's just not true. That does not encourage me to go out and buy a Porsche. No more than Volkswagen faking their emission makes me believe that Volkswagen's technology is really the kind of standard that I want in my car, that I drive my family around. So this message is essentially anti-brand. So whether or not it fits your company values, it should fit your bottom line. If you don't do something stupid, you don't fake your data, then there's clear bottom line advantages. So this raises essentially the fifth and final point, which is that the science needs to be valid. And this is a point that's been raised multiple times over the last 2 days. But it's really important that you get the science right. Now, nobody gets science right all the time, and we accept that. But there are procedures and processes that help us try to do it. And one important component of that is transparency from the science side. That is to say, we aren't doing bespoke proprietary analyses. Anything that we do, we publish in peer-reviewed journals for the whole world to see, and that was, my point earlier about, one of the talks was how great it is to see those things were open and viewable by anyone who's interested in the details, because that keeps people accountable. Hilke also raised what's probably my favorite example of this, which is this fMRI experiment done by Martin Lindstrom, who frankly was the face of it, but he didn't do the science, where people were looking at why are you so attached to your iPhone? And they had a hypothesis, actually. They had a clear hypothesis that you were addicted to it. And we know something about the brain signatures of addiction. So that's what they were looking for with the MRI scanner. What they found was something completely different, and they found this insula activation that they read as romantic love. You were romantically in love with your iPhone, which just seems a little bit mad. Not least of which is the fact that literally 1/3 of all fMRI studies report insula activation. And as Hilke pointed out, it's much more commonly associated with disgust. But as Hilke and Vinod pointed out, this problem of reverse inference is essentially bad science. And bad science has consequences because Apple had developed a big advertising campaign around "You love your iPhone" that got quietly shelved when an article appeared in the New York Times signed by 82 neuroscientists saying fMRI plus marketing equals complete crap. That was actually the title of the article that was printed in the New York Times. And then Apple quietly sort of made that £1 million advertising campaign go away. So there's actual real costs to getting the science wrong, and it's an important aspect. What does that mean for us, scientists, right? Because I think that this is something that's very rarely considered in an ethical perspective. Look, the reality is examples like this make scientists cringe, and they make us step away for the most part. So the basic community response is that neuromarketing is just snake oil that's done to gull the public, right, and or companies. And scientists who engage in this, me, some of the others in this room, routinely get accused of selling out, right? And I understand their perspective because I think that there's an important ethical issue. Should we be doing science that's involved in helping someone sell more widgets, right? But I also don't think that's entirely the right way to frame the question. Because just because there's bad examples out there, and this is a bad Mercedes example. So this was a print ad based on the neuromyth that your left and right brains are fundamentally different, that said that driving a Mercedes appeals to your left logical language engineering brain, and driving a Mercedes appeals to your right artistic, creative, emotional brain, and driving a Mercedes unifies your hemispheres in an ultimate driving experience. This is just total nonsense. Driving a bicycle does the same thing. It's based on a neuromyth. And these things abound. My in my daughter's school, there are posters on the wall about left and right brain, about like why it's important to take art and math classes. And the first time I saw that, needless to say, got a little upset. And my daughter very firmly explained to me that I was not allowed to talk to the headmistress. And not just now, anytime in the future, I was not allowed to speak with her. So it gets us upset, right? So bad science is bad, but does that mean that we should step back and not engage at any level? And I think the answer to that is no, because there's a massive amount of public interest, both from the general public and from the industrial sectors, from government, from healthcare. And with that level of interest, if we don't provide help with the science, who's going to? People who aren't trained in science? Well, what do you expect? What are you going to get but bad science? And let me just give an example of this historically, which I think is an important one. Back in the 1830s, this guy, Gall, started measuring the bumps on people's heads and using it to measure personality, mental facilities. And it was called phrenology. The scientific community at the time thought it was nuts. Like, if you read the textbooks, it sounds like people were like, "Ooh, that's really interesting." That's not what the science community thought. They thought he was crazy. And therefore, they just said, well, he's doing bad science. We're not going to engage with that. There was massive public attention to this. People were going around in the 1830s and 1840s at fairs, reading people's skulls and telling them about their personality and things like that. To the extent that in the 1850s, in both Philadelphia and in parts in the UK, when you applied to a job, you had to provide a letter from your phrenologist that gave them your personality response, exactly so that they could use that material to put you into the right job, right? Although it turns out they mostly used it to prevent certain people from getting jobs, particularly women and people from ethnic minorities. So, you know, what's worse is that this phrenology, this kind of personalized medicine approach, was what was cited by Galton, that father of eugenics, right? He said, look, there's science for why white men are the superior people. Honest to God, this was the argument for him and his eugenics group. Women were inferior, they shouldn't have a right to vote. All other races were inferior, and he was basing it on phrenological information. So, and in the Nuremberg trials in the early 50s, multiple Nazis who were convicted of war crimes cited eugenics work as the reason that they engaged in the Holocaust, okay? So I'm not trying to draw the line that the scientist who said, Gall, he's an idiot, I'm not going to play his game, were responsible for the Holocaust. But there is no doubt that there is a line that can be drawn between them that comes about because the scientific community chose to step back and not engage with what they were expert at when there was a call for them. Now, I think that for us, I don't imagine that it's anything quite as dramatic, but I also think there are positive reasons for why we should be involved, right? So that is to say, I think that, I mean, and the talks have illustrated this. One, scientists get access to data sets that we could never dream of by working with industry, working with government. Nicola's examples and Janet's examples from earlier today were brilliant examples of that. You know, you run 30, 40 people through a lab and you feel really good. You go to South Africa and do a study with 1 million people in a health plan, that's a different world, right? And you get different insights from that. And that's incredibly valuable. In addition, my own experience is that by working with other groups, you generate new research questions, right? So particularly my work with Audible, with Tom, really changed the way I saw some of the things that I was doing in my lab and that led my research in new directions. And that was fantastic, right? You can stagnate by not engaging. So there are values at a pure research level. One of the things that you saw in every talk probably was people thanking their graduate students. The opportunities that this provides for our students are phenomenal, right? These are real-world environments where people are applying the things that they're learning and making a difference. That's fabulous. There's lots of positive reasons for us to engage with science beyond what I would say is a moral obligation. But I honestly do think that there's a moral obligation on the neuroscience community, the behavioral science community, to engage and not leave a vacuum where things are done poorly. You're probably familiar with this image. This is the Gartner hype cycle. And the idea is that anytime there's a new technology introduced, you get this kind of boom and bust in this. So initially, people think it's great. It does everything. And of course, no new tech does everything. So you get all these disappointed people who think, oh, well, it doesn't do anything. Right? So you get this peak of inflated expectations. You get this trough of disillusionment. And over time, as people become educated and familiar with the technology and where it fits in their business model and where it doesn't, you get to a point where it becomes productive. And I think this is actually where Hilke started us with yesterday in saying it's a set of tools that complements the existing tools that we have and maybe adds certain value under certain circumstances. And I think that Vinod's talk actually started to quantify what those circumstances were and which tools help under which circumstances. But by engaging, we help that process. We help move us towards this plateau of productivity and get past this kind of hyperbole that's associated with these techniques. Okay, so where does that leave us? I think that it's important that we find some kind of balance, right? So just because these ethical issues exist means that we should take them seriously. We can't just say, it doesn't apply to me, Gov, right? It's not my problem. I think that we have to be very serious about this, and those trust figures emphasize the scope of the problem. How do we do this? Well, I think that if we sort of use these kind of principles as a basic foundation, it's a good start. It's certainly not the final piece, and I think we could argue for different principles and adding additional ones, but let's just start with these. So first of all, the experimentation has to be voluntary. People shouldn't be forced into doing it or deceived into providing physiological or neurological data. And that means, if it's voluntary, that means you can stop as well. If you start it, there's no reason why you can't step out. Second, the data that we collect have to be limited. They can only be collected for specific, explicit, and legitimate purposes. And the purpose must be clearly stated. And as part of that, we have to know that the data are only being stored as needed and aren't being transferred beyond what is needed as well. Third, it really is essential that we're talking about people being volunteering and opting in with informed consent, right? So they need to be aware how the data are being collected, any risks associated with that, and some of those risks are my data being shipped off to other companies? You know, the Facebook example with Cambridge Analytica is probably the most salient recent one, but it's a real concern. Fourth is that we have to be free from manipulation, right? And this is tricky because we could start to argue about where manipulation begins and ends. But I don't think participants should be forced or deceived into making decisions they would otherwise make. This is a slope, right? Because, for instance, in the UK and in the US, there are rules about where, like, certain advertising can't be done close to schools because children are seen as more vulnerable to manipulation than adults. So this is tricky how we draw this line, but nonetheless, I think that the principle is an important one. And then finally, I think it's really critical that we talk about the science being valid. That means that it really should be led by scientifically trained staff. Martin Lindstrom, who I'm sure is a great guy, but is a brand guru, shouldn't be running an fMRI machine, okay? And I'm not trying to throw the guy under the bus, but the reality is you make basic errors if you don't have training in how you use these things. It's important that we have people who are trained up on how to do it right. So just to be clear, I'd like to take this beyond just the idea that there's a voluntary code of ethics. So if it was just simply, hey, we agree with those principles, fine, now trust us, I don't think that's enough. I think that we have to adopt something much more like these institutional review boards. And how we construct it is important for it, but I mean, they've got to be cross-disciplinary group of scholars and practitioners that are actively monitoring what's going on, developing standards as we develop the techniques, because we're the ones who are up to date enough to be proactive. We have to have assessment mechanisms in place for monitoring compliance, and I think that we have to have the ability to sanction groups that violate these norms, exactly like ethics panels do for human experimentation elsewhere. More generally, I think that there's actually a reasonable call for governments to adopt a right to cognitive liberty. where cognitive liberty includes the right to cognitive privacy and a right to freedom from cognitive manipulation. I don't know the right wording for how to make that into something that's legally binding, but I do think that it should be a basic human right that we have this right to cognitive liberty. And I think I'd like to stop it there, and thank you very much for your attention. I will now ask myself a question.
So thank you for your interesting talk, Joe. So is there any question from the audience?
Thank you for this great talk. I think you deserve many questions, so I'm gonna ask one. So regarding China, I think they violate everything you said in your talk. Yeah. Then what should we do then? That is, if we follow all your suggestions, and I believe we should, China won't do that.
Right.
That means they're gonna have an advantage somehow. What that mean for the, I would say, the future of humanity, but also for the other countries? That is, if we all agree to restrain ourselves, then we might lose any economical or even social advantage in the future.
Yeah, that's a really good and really hard question. What do we do? I guess at some level it's predicated on the idea that this does give them an advantage, right? And I'm not sure that it does. I mean, I think that it gives them an advantage in certain human rights abuses, but I'm happy for them to have that advantage. I think that what we need to do is I think that if we could hash out as a community a voluntary code of ethics that we essentially signed up for, as well as what it actually means, this idea of freedom from manipulation, then optionally people are going to opt in. It would be great to then get certain governments to opt in as well. In a perfect world, I'd love to see the right to cognitive liberty be a UN part of the human rights, but I don't see that as an immediate or even soon kind of thing. It's really hard on our colleagues in China. We all have friends and colleagues who work in universities in China who are outstanding scientists, neuroscientists, behavioral scientists, who would essentially agree with this kind of a program, but would disagree with the way China is using some of their technology. And I don't think that's specific to China. I mean, I think that there are people like, look, I know the scientist who did the Martin Lindstrom study reasonably well. She's British. I think most of us would think that she didn't do a good job. So it's not unique to any country, other than the fact that their government has aggressively pursued it. I think I just don't know a convincing answer to deal with it at that level, other than international pressure to accept that there needs to be some standards that we all agree to. I don't think the cost of getting that wrong is going to be that we fall behind, but maybe I'm just being myopic, I don't know. Yeah, it's a great question.
Hello? Okay. So I'm wondering where you think the line is drawn on understanding human behavior and the human brain to influence individuals, and the point to which it's okay and when it starts to become not okay, since a lot of things that advertisers do are kind of understanding human behavior. Sure. And in some ways, you can maybe say it's manipulating behavior, influencing behavior. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a really good, another hard question. I think that when it becomes coercive or when it's deceptive, it's no longer okay. So, for instance, if you think back to the 70s, the idea of product placement in films and TV was a relatively new thing, and there was a massive outcry. Like, Coke is sneaking Coke bottles into my cinema, and it's making the children into mindless consumers of Coke, right? I mean, this was a legitimate kind of thing that was raised. Nowadays, everybody's so aware of product placement or celebrity endorsement. You know, a lot of these kind of techniques that are used are just standard, and as a result, it's less worrisome because people are well aware of what it is, what it's being used for, and the limits of its effectiveness. So at some level, I feel like that's a familiarity and education campaign so that some of these things will become clearer. The one thing that I think we should be clear about is that it's not the case that neuroscience has shown us something so fundamentally new that advertisers were never doing it before. What we've done is gone back and said, well, why is this effective? How does this affect your dopamine system and give you a reward benefit? And why is it more effective under this circumstances or that circumstances? We haven't come up with some brand new thing, which is what a lot of people expect. And they expect the same of educational neuroscience. Like the neuroscientists are going to tell teachers, you've been teaching wrong for just a few millennia, and this is the correct way to do it based on brains. No, that's nonsense, right? What we can answer is why. And using that understanding of why, we can then perhaps start tweaking things to make them more or less effective. But I feel like as that productivity approaches, people will also be coming along with us on that journey, and they'll recognize this manipulation for what it is, which is essentially a marketing campaign.
Thank you.
Any other questions from audience? Okay, so let's take a question from Slido. So can we trust the industry to regulate itself? Are the benefits of trust outweighed by the opportunities for profit?
Yeah, I think that this is at the heart of things, right? And I think the answer is, yeah, we can trust the industry to monitor itself, because actually getting it wrong affects profit too. So I don't think, again, I feel like misuse of these technologies isn't the solution for, you know, corporate wealth or becoming the next Mark Zuckerberg or something like that. I feel like there's a clear benefit to doing it right, doing it ethically, getting trust in the public population. And I think that we can do that in part in conjunction. So I think that by academics and industry working together, I mean, if you just take the mean of the professor's trust and the advertiser's trust, you're already at 50%, which is a big step up. So if we're there monitoring each other and helping out, I don't see any particular reason why this can't work. Will there be exceptions or people that don't follow this and go the wrong way? Sure, that's just human nature. If they see a perceived benefit to flouting the rules, some people will do that. On the other hand, I think that as a community, this is something that we can do ourselves.
So another question is, so we have measures for improving validity of science.
Yep.
But how do we get companies to prioritize good over flashy science?
Well, there's no reason we can't use those same kind of methods, right? I mean, so the medical community has to pre-register every trial that they do because they were misusing a lot of the science and giving us, you know, studies that showed that nicotine was totally not addictive. And this really wasn't run by Philip Morris, honestly. But of course it was. So I think that if it became important enough, if there was such a lack of trust that we weren't convincing the public that we were engaging in ethical processes, then there's no reason why we couldn't adopt some of these pre-registration approaches, preprint archive servers, and things like that. It's not a really difficult process. It's not entirely successful, but we've all, well, at least many of us in the room probably have already done this started adopting it for our science. And I think that the next generation of scientists who are coming up all think this is just normal. And I think that's great. That's a very positive development.
I'm going to try saying something provocative just to get the discussion going, right? Along the same lines of what you said, there is a change in people's expectations. So one argument is this distinction between self-harm versus others' benefit with no harm to myself, right? So let's go back to the billboard example that you had. The idea in the billboard example is, yes, my face is being tracked, somebody is getting some data out of it, but it's not being traced back to me in any form. It's been aggregated in some way to say, like, what's the proportion of engagement, or how people are reacting to whatever I'm putting over there, right? So somebody is benefiting from it. I don't get anything out of it. I wasn't told that I'm going to help somebody benefit, but beyond that, nothing else is probably going to happen to me in this particular scenario.
Right.
Is that a distinction, or is that not a distinction?
Well, so I like the provide, that's good. So let me ask two questions in return to that, which is one, why do you think that it's not linked to you? This is in an airport where your face is actually been scanned multiple times from passport as well as, security cameras. Is there any particular reason to think that your data isn't being explicitly linked to Vinod Benatrankman, right, as you sit there?
Yeah.
And the other is, one of the things they want to do with this is personalize the ads, right? So I'm in the mall or airport or whatever, and I'm a middle-aged white guy, so the ads that I see involve like Porsches and, I don't know, expensive watches or something like that. But what I really want is to find a place to get my wife a gift. And of course, none of those ads are going to come up. So at some level, there's an opportunity cost to me, because I've just been essentially profiled, and based on that profile, they've given me something that may or may not benefit me. So I know that I'm hypothetical in both of those examples, but I think that a cynical look could see that just the other way.
But there are other instances where people like it, though, right?
Yeah,
that's the changing face of this.
Yeah.
And it's becoming in some ways hard to know what you consented to,
yes,
and how far it goes. So you agree for a link between your Google searches and your email address, and the next thing you know, wherever you are, you get like, oh, you're close to a restaurant, that's probably a good fit for you. Do you want to do it?
Right.
And to be honest, if you're in an unknown place, it feels like great. Yeah, I didn't have to do that search. It's telling me what I have to do.
True.
But I think that's the problem here. I think even people themselves are struggling with what they want to define as privacy, or what they want to define as protected information, and that's what makes this more complex than what it is.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with you. And at some level, what I'd be interested in is hearing other people's ideas and getting that kind of discussion going, because I don't think that any of these things are going to be solved by me or anyone else standing up and saying, this is what I think. I think that what's valuable here is that we have essentially a grassroots movement where we discuss these issues, try to figure out where these lines are and what people want and don't want, and what their perceptions are, because they may be very different than my perceptions. Yeah.
And just to, there are several other examples that are clearly like not in the boundary, clearly on the other side of it. But there are also situations where it's a little bit more tricky than that, for sure.
Yeah. And those are the really interesting cases, right?
Yep.
The ones that are clear, more or less everyone agrees, that's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
So let's thank Joe again.
Thank you.